Hello and welcome to Read Through the Word. Today is Saturday, November 16th. And today we continue on in the book of Acts and we start in the book of 1 Thessalonians. And our lesson for today is called God's Kindness. So we're going to start out, talk about kind of two different things actually today. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the verse in Acts chapter 17, verse 23. We know that Paul has been traveling and he is talking to the people of Athens. And of course, there are, altars and, statues, temples, whatever, to all these different, to all these different gods. But gods, both of the Greeks and of the Romans. And so he's talking to people in Athens, and in verse 22, so chapter 17, 22, he says, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." Just a note too that the Greek word oftentimes in that time period in the Greco-Roman world, when the word says men, that often refers to mixed groups, because kind of like we say mankind today. So he's talking to the people of Athens and says, "I see that in every way you are very religious, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now, what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you." So here's the interesting thing. The archaeological Bible talks about how the Greeks were fearful of offending any god by failing to give him or her attention. They felt they could cover any omission by the label unknown God. And other Greek writers confirm that such similar altars could be seen in Athens. So the Greeks, had all these different gods, and they were very nervous about appeasing these gods, about possibly failing them. It was kind of like, what if we missed one? What if we missed some god that we might make angry? So they create this altar to the unknown God. It's not because they were like, well, we don't really know, It's not that they created that because they didn't have any other gods they were worshiping. It was kind of like their covering, so to speak, in case they forgot some god and might fail to appease that god. So when Paul says, you worship something as unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you, he says, it's almost like he's saying, did you know that you are worshiping an unknown God? But of course, Paul is referring to the one true God. And he's saying, you did miss someone. You have all these altars and temples, all these things to worship different gods for different reasons. And you have this one altar of all these unknown ones, just in case you missed one. And he's saying, you did miss one. And it is covered under these unknown gods. So it's almost like he's taking their way of thinking and kind of like speaking within their language, saying, all these unknown gods that you're just sort of like appealing to in case you miss someone. That's the God, the one true God that you're missing. I just think it's very interesting how Paul was so adept at speaking to different audiences and taking their beliefs, their culture, their own religious systems, and somehow he found ways of communicating to people within these systems in a way that they might be more open to or might be more provoked to thought about. And so I just think it's a very interesting approach. So he's saying you should look into that. You should look into these unknown gods because you know, that's because the one true God is a part of that. And you need to know who he is. And of course, he proclaims, the sovereignty and the truth of the one true God. But he does it in such a fascinating way to me. So just something to think about there. It's kind of an interesting section too in the Archaeological Bible about the Epicureans. I will put some information about that in the notes. I'm not going to go into it in the lesson time, but I will put some information because it's interesting to know the kind of people groups that Paul was meeting and how they might have received what he was saying and, kind of how all that communication went. So I want to turn now to the second part of our lesson, to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. In verse 7, it says, "But we were gentle," Paul is speaking to the Thessalonians, "but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children." And then a little bit further down in verse 11, "For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory." This reminds me of when one of my daughters came to have a personal understanding of who Jesus was. She was adopted, and so there were years of her life where I did not know her, and where she experienced things that were out of my control, and where she did not learn about who God was. So when she came into my life, she had never heard or known about God. And I knew that her life before coming into my care was not easy. And so the way that I taught her about God was very gentle. I wanted her to know that God the Father is, that he encourages us, comforts us, helps us continue on in our faith in a loving, kind, and very gentle way. And I still remember the day that she came to this personal knowledge of who Jesus was and what Jesus had done for her and how he loved her. It makes me think of the verse in Romans 2:4 that says that the kindness of God is intended to lead to repentance. The kindness of God. And I thought about that. There are times where there is misuse and abuse and sin, and there needs to be clear accountability. But I think it's important to remember, too, that especially when you're dealing with someone who has been wounded, they don't necessarily need to hear how bad they are. What they really want to know is there a God? And does he love me? What is he like? Does he really love someone like me? And I think this is such a beautiful way to look at the way the Father loves us and the way we can love others, our children and others around us. Encouraging, comforting, urging each other on to continue on despite difficulties or woundedness or pain or sorrow or struggles or addictions or whatever it is. The kindness of God can lead others to repentance. And so just a thought as I think about how deeply that impacted my own daughter to prioritize to her the gentleness, the goodness, the absolute unconditional love of God. And that is what deeply moved her heart. So just something to think about today. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.